a person with a disability living in an able-bodied world felt like an outcast a lot of times. But the church, I didn't. The church, I found a home, a place where I belonged, a place where I was loved. Not only that, but really empowered to figure out who I was and my gifts and to do things I never thought I could do, like be a priest of the church.
Welcome to The Race to Social Justice, a podcast that explores the myriad racial and social challenges facing the modern world, with your hosts, Kiva White and John Kepner. Thank you for being part of the courageous conversation, because when it comes to combating social injustices in America, it is not about being confrontational. It is about being conversational.
Hello, John.
Hi, Kiva. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. Well, welcome everyone to our Race to Social Justice podcast series. I'm Kiva White. I am the Black guy.
And I'm John Kepner, the white guy. Kiva and I share the love of the letter K. K for Kiva, K for Kepner, and K for our thirst for knowledge. It's what you call, Kiva, the K factor.
That's right. The K factor. Knowledge is power and knowledge is necessary. And so we all like to dispense knowledge here at the Race to Social Justice podcast. And our goal is really to promote racial and social equity and justice through honest and even often, sometimes difficult dialogue. What me and John, we call our courageous conversations. You know, over the years, John and I have found that our discussions with each other have really deepened our respective understandings of racism and a wide range of other forms of social inequities in our society, and our personal responsibilities to really make this world a better place for all. And it really led us to invite guests to share their honest experiences and learnings around this topic. And we hope these podcast conversations will help our listeners and even our viewers and even our guests in their own personal journeys as we really dive into these discussions. So please subscribe, please click the like button, and join us on this race to social justice. So, John, who is our guest today?
Well, our guest, I'm delighted to introduce the Reverend Emily Richards, who happens to be, full disclosure, the priest in charge at the Episcopal church that I go to in White Marsh, Pennsylvania. Emily is a proud native of Kentucky, which means that she loves horse racing and particularly basketball, but we'll try to stay away from that topic. We've had a previous focused discussion about basketball with another guest. Emily was educated at the University of the South, where she got her divinity degree and her master's of divinity. And next year, she will have been a priest for 20 years. Wow. 2003. She came to our church from a church close by in Glenside, but before that, she served as a vicar at St. Albans Episcopal Church in Moorhead, Kentucky, and then she was an assistant rector at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Richfield, Connecticut. And she's been very active in our, what we call a deanery, which is a kind of an association of Episcopal churches in our region. And she's been chaplain for the Champions of the Holy Cross. You can maybe tell us what the Champions of the Holy Cross are. But anyway, Emily and I when we met, we had a discussion about social justice and racial equity and that sort of thing. And what we'll see, I hope, today in discussing with her, that's general subject, that she has three different perspectives on that subject. Okay, so unique perspectives. Yeah. So without further ado, I guess I'm going to ask the first question, right?
Emily? Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. You will find Emily to be very enthusiastic. She's going to be a great guest.
I like enthusethem. That's what we need. That's what we need when we run in this type of race. We need that. We do.
Yes.
So let's jump in, John.
Good. Okay. So let's start with your origin story. You grew up in Kentucky. Tell us about your dad and your mom and your early childhood. Particularly as it relates to the subject at hand today, where things you experienced as a child and growing up.
Yeah. So, I am a native Kentuckian. I've lived in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for 13 years, and before that in Connecticut. So you can kind of still hear my Southern accent, but it's been a while since I've lived in Kentucky, but I grew up there. Generations of family, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents are from Kentucky. Actually, both my brothers still live in Kentucky. So the roots are deep there. I grew up in, the South and a white person in the South in pretty much a white bubble. A pretty affluent, well-educated Episcopal family, and had great opportunities because of my family. My parents, I am who I am today because of my parents and the values they instilled in me, and the sense of passion and care and respect I received from them. My father grew up in the Episcopal Church. My mother did not. But Lexington, Kentucky. So, a city of about 300,000, but seemed like a very small world to me. And felt very loved and supported by my family, very close-knit family. But part of my early story that has influenced me and my view on social justice issues is that when I was 6 months old, I became very, very ill. I was the first child, so the oldest child of my parents. They were at the time 24 and 26. And I became very, very ill. And it took a long time I ended up having to go to the University of Kentucky Medical Center for a doctor to finally diagnose me with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is an immunology illness. And for the first 6 years of my life was in constant chronic pain. And as a baby, I mean, my parents tell stories of they would touch me, you're a newborn, you want to hold them, you want to rock them, you feed them. And I would scream at the top of my lungs because my joints, because that's what it is. It's a, rheumatic fever, get that rheumatology disease. And so it was, my joints were inflamed and I was in huge amounts of pain. And, doctors really didn't know what to do because it's so rare at that age. And went through a lot of different kinds of medication and treatments and was in physical therapy at the age of 2. And then after I was 6 years old, the disease kind of burned itself out. I know doctor likes to say that. They don't like to say I'm in remission, but I haven't had any of the symptoms. But what happened was that the illness was so severe that it severely crippled my joints. And so from the time of really age 10 until age 20, I had 10 surgeries. And I'm 50 now, and in the past 30 years, I've had 6 surgeries, which is pretty good when in a 10-year span, I had about 10 surgeries. So I lived with a physical disability. I still do, and can get around thanks to the work of phenomenal orthopedic surgeons and assistive devices. But because of that, I mean, that experience just shaped my whole life and view of the world, and of other humans that live on this earth with me. And it just gave me a sense of compassion for others who felt like that they didn't belong and were outsiders and were treated differently because of the way they looked. Or I can tell lots of stories about, ableism over the years, but, so it really did. And so for me, struggling as a young person to find a place where I belonged in an able-bodied world, a person with a body that didn't work the same and treated differently and discriminated against because of that. And at the same time, and this has been my adult journey, is realizing that because of the color of my skin, I have received great privileges. And because of the care that I received from my parents, and because they could afford to send me to the best doctors and all of that, I have had great opportunities. And I think it was in the past few years, I read something that the group of Americans who are the poorest and who are, considered the most on the margins of society are people of color with illness, and have the least opportunity and support. And it just hit me because of the color of my skin. Even though I felt as a child and still as an adult, sometimes very much of an outsider, I still have had such great privilege. And so that's something that as an adult I've been grappling with, and really working towards, in my role as a pastor, preacher, teacher, how do we make our world a more just world where that is not the case, that everybody has like the opportunities I've been able to have and overcome obstacles that I have. And so that, that is a really important part of who I am. And I think has helped me have compassion and understanding for others who, have been treated differently and, discriminated against.
You said you have plenty of stories. Could you tell us one that really can bring this home in a personal way for our listeners? In terms of,
I'll tell you one that's kind of funny.
Yeah,
I'll tell you one that's kind of funny because you do have to sometimes laugh at some of these things. But I remember because I used it as a teaching. So before I was ordained an Episcopal priest, I taught. And guess where I taught? Mississippi. Boy, that was an interesting time. I taught at an Episcopal school and lived in Mississippi for 3 years. But I taught, and I was, I had students, and so they were very, of course, high school students asking me tons of questions and everything, and trying to understand my point of view and how I live and move and have my being in this world. And I took my students to Italy. We had the great opportunity of going on this trip. And beforehand, I had said to them, now, you're just going to experience what it's like with me in a wheelchair in the airport, and just be prepared. And they were like, at the time I was Miss Barr, because I was still single at that time. And they're, oh, Miss Barr, but they've got to know that you're the teacher and you're the one in authority. And I said, let me just tell you, because I'm in this chair, what it's going to be like. And we went up to the counter and I had all the tickets. I'm with like 10 kids and I'm clearly the one that has the tickets and organizing the trip. And the person, first of all, didn't look me in the eye. Looked at I was young, but still, in my 20s, and looked at the 14-year-old. And I kept answering the questions, and then they kept talking to the teenager. And then, or this happens a lot, slow down their speech or get very loud again. And I actually, the student of mine who was pushing me in the wheelchair got so frustrated, kind of righteous indignation, and said, excuse me, ma'am, but this is our teacher. She is our teacher. And we wouldn't be going on this trip if it wasn't for her. And the poor woman at the desk was like, and then later I said, didn't I tell you? And they're like, oh my gosh, we had no idea, Miss Barr, what it was like. But again, it was a great teaching moment for these students that it was like, really, this is what it's like to live in your body. This is like what it's like to be in the world as a disabled person. And I was like, yeah. So, I mean, I just will never forget that because I really use it as a teaching moment. And I said, so I hope that the next time you see someone in a wheelchair, you don't treat them the same way that this person at the end treated me.
Yeah, I mean, we call those microaggressions. Those
exactly.
And most of the time, people equate that with race-based discrimination. And so I really appreciate you framing that from your lived experiences and how how it impacted your life. Because I think microaggressions, just by definition, is a kind of like misleading in a sense because micro is small. Most people seem like it's a small little thing. Why are you getting so upset about something that's so little? But I always say it's a small thing that creates big problems in our society.
Right.
And so I really, we learn a lot in this show by sharing our lived experiences and having these conversations. Right. So I really appreciate you being transparent and sharing that. So, and like you said, so other people who are hearing or watching this, when the next time you all see somebody in a wheelchair, be respectful. Don't make assumptions about. Don't make
assumptions.
Correct. About who they are and their capacity to contribute to society in general.
Right.
So I wanted to circle back on something you had mentioned earlier in your in your discussion and sharing about your personal life when you said you lived in, I'm quoting here, a white bubble in Kentucky, right? So just growing up in the South and what was it like for you? When and how did you become aware of race? Because most people who grow up in those bubbles, it's an experience. And so share a little bit about your first experience of difference.
So, I mean, a white family, a white neighborhood. I had the opportunity to go to a private school. Actually, my private school was my really first experience of people of color. Now, they would be called the model minority because they were Asians, either, from different parts of Asia. But that was kind of my first, but my church, the Episcopal church, a very white church. But I thought about this before being with you all. The place that really brought about my awareness of race for the first time really was the college I went to, the University of the South, in Swanee, Tennessee. Very white school. I went there for undergraduate and then went back for divinity school, as John said. And both times, though, I had significant experiences that I think helped me in my growing awareness of racism, my relationship to race. When I was an undergrad, one of my favorite professors started a program in the summer for kids from Chattanooga, from urban Chattanooga, all kids of color, to come up on the mountain and to really help them in their educational pursuits. And what was great, it wasn't just a summer camp, but it was like they formed relationships and helped these kids through high school and helped them, determine what their next path was going to be. And so invited me to come and be one of the counselors, summer camp, It was my first, here I was, and even in college, very white, the University of the South. So you can imagine the history of the University of the South. I used to be in a minority in an able-bodied world, but I was a minority in a new way because all the kids, the campers, were kids of color, and most of the counselors were kids of color.
Wow.
And here I was, this little white girl, with a disability. I mean, of course, I love people, and, so
Yeah.
I learned so much. I grew so much. Where I really grew is the fellow college students, because there's a small group of college students at Swanee that are people of color, and a small minority. And of course, I hadn't really engaged. I'll be honest. I still lived in that white bubble, even in college, and that I became friends with them. And then for the rest of my time at college, we still kind of lived in separate worlds, but, we were very intentional. Like, I'd go to the Black Student Union for parties, and I was friends, and I just listened, and I learned so much. Like, one experience that happened that I was so appalled about, but you hear this so often. We were having a picnic, and one of my fellow counselors, young Black man, I don't know what he was doing, but he had a knife out. I'm not kidding you. Someone saw him with a knife and called the police. This is Swanee, Tennessee, on a mountain, so safe. He was a college student,
Yeah.
he was a Swanee student. And I was furious, kind of like those students with me when I was a teacher and they couldn't believe how I was being treated as a person.
Mm-hmm.
I was furious for him. I couldn't believe it. I was like in tears, and I was just like, this is just awful. And he just, Emily, I deal with this all the time. And this was in the 1990s.
Yeah.
Like, I deal with this all the time. And so, gosh, my sense of myself and my sense of my place in the world and others' place in the world. And so that started me on that journey. And I just wanted to learn more from my new friends and their experiences. And of course, the high school kids, they wanted to learn from me. They're like, they would want to do my hair because they weren't used to a white girl's hair. And, and then I'd ask questions of them about, well, tell me about, just things that we just take for granted. And because we are in bubbles or whatever, we don't get to experience the very humanness of someone else, and instead of the stereotypes. And so and then let me just tell you quickly the other. So I did that for 2 summers, that camp, and it really was an amazing experience. I learned I received more than those kids received from me. But then when I returned to Swanee for seminary, divinity school, we had the dean of the seminary. We had an interim dean for 1 year. And he had been the bishop of Mississippi in he'd been a priest in Mississippi in the 1960s. He later became the bishop. White man of privilege, Mississippi, grew up in Mississippi. And he had been a religious leader in the civil rights movement in Mississippi.
Wow.
And in fact, when James married, he was the chaplain at Ole Miss and the priest at the church there in, okay, where is Ole Miss? Now I can't remember. But anyway, there at Ole Miss, the priest, he was there when James Meredith. He was there helping escort James Meredith onto the campus. And he got up and preached in the pulpit at an all-white Episcopal church the day before this happened about the sin of racism in the white church. And he was booed. And, he hung in there. And then all this, and it was just so inspiring. And he continued. He was one of the only white clergymen who stood with his Black brothers in the fight in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. And he's unknown, but again, he's one of those people that it's like, he's one of my personal saints. And he was so inspiring. And he said what formed him is when he was in seminary at Swanee, all of the faculty of the divinity school left en masse because the school would not allow kids of color, Black students, and the entire faculty of the divinity school resigned.
Wow.
And he said, their witness told me, if I'm going to be a priest in the church, I better step up and do this. So both of those, so being at this very white school, the University of the South, I learned so much.
Right. So we talk about the word allyship, like how to be an ally in this, race to social justice. Dr. King had white counterparts that helped him, and they were allies. So what would you say to a person who is stuck in this bubble? What would you say to encourage them to, start on this journey of embracing, the beauty that's in the world and all the difference that's in the world today? What would you say to that person that's still stuck in, and using your terms, the bubble?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, I feel blessed. I'm going to use religious language here, that I was confronted by that and had wonderful, friends, Black friends, white friends who helped me learn about myself. I do think that the journey starts within you. Yeah. And I think also having the humility, and I've gotten it wrong a lot, Kiva. I've gotten it wrong a lot, but having the humility of really listening and not making those assumptions. I know what it's like having people make assumptions about me. And so really trying to listen to my friends of color, my colleagues of color, and not make assumptions about their lives, their experiences. So I think it starts there.
Yeah.
And not, the white savior complex.
Yeah.
White progressives or white Christian progressives are really good at, and we mean well, and we want to help, but then we come in and we think we have all the answers.
Yeah. Intent versus impact.
Right. So, I think the first thing it starts with is just listening.
Yeah.
And learning and wanting to be in relationship. And then for me, I've had to do a lot of work on myself and my own story. And then to just ask your friends, how can I be an ally? But I think if the relationship, if the trust, if the storytelling doesn't happen first, it's hard to get to that place, because I've had friends of color say, you got it all wrong, Emily. And I could, okay, well, I want to talk through this, So, and I'm still on the journey of being an ally, and that's awesome. Know I have a long way to go.
I like the fact you're using the word journey, because we, the title of this podcast is The Race to Social Justice, because we're constantly running and racing and trying to get to the finish line of human dignity and treating everybody in a just way. And it's a constant run. And, like you mentioned, what was experienced with the young man with the knife, that happened back in 1990. We did a previous podcast when we were talking about the Rodney King, and that was almost 20, 30 something years ago. So it's still happening. We're still running this race. And so I like how you offered some words of encouragement to those who are trying to just get out of that bubble. So I appreciate that. John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking as you've been talking that you could look at being disabled or being Black or being different as an obstacle, or you could look at it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Now, I have the impression that you took the latter route.
Yeah.
And it started earlier than your, awakening of racial justice with your disability. Right. So could you talk about sort of this mindset that people who are different have to go through? I don't have that burden.
Right.
I'm a little different now because I'm older than most people. But
so ageism, you're gonna get hit by one of those.
Okay, so
John. I've told John that I always say that being a person with a disability, this is the one minority group that everyone joins someday because of ageism. But yeah, John, I think, and there have been a lot of times where I have it, where the obstacles in front of me, I don't know if I want to continue the race. And that's where allyship helps. I had amazing parents. I had friends. That's why community, whether it's church or whatever, but community is so important. Community, having your community to run the race with you, or to be on the sidelines giving you that drink of water when you're about ready to you're on your last leg of the marathon, and cheering you on. I think some of it is what was instilled in me from my parents, and they were different. My mother she was out there in front. Like, no one is going to tell you can't do something. She was my very vocal advocate. My father was quieter and worked hard to care for me. But both of them just said, you can do whatever you put your mind to, Emily. We believe in you. And I think that's the thing I realize, is that how many people don't have that person. And it takes one person in your life. It doesn't have to be a mother or a father. It could be a teacher or a grandmother or a friend, but just having that, so I still hear their voices in my head that, as hard as it gets, you can do this. I think, there is some of, just like the model minority, there is the model person with a disability. I don't know any difference. I don't know what it's like living in a body that works well. And I have had friends who were in a wheelchair because they were in an accident. Like, I actually had a college friend. We were the only two disabled people at my college at that time. Better now, but because it wasn't very accessible. But he was angry. He had a major chip on his shoulder. But I would tell my friends, they're like, why are you just so much more positive and it's easier to be around you? And I'm like, I don't know what I've lost. He was 16 and an athlete and was in a car accident. He's 20. I don't know what that was a blessing in disguise for me. I don't know any different. And he's grieving and he is angry and he's going through that stage of grief. And we just got to let him do that and honor that. And so, but also I've learned, the sunshiny person with inspirational person with a disability gets you a lot further than being the angry, bitter, So some of it is what culture, you just learn how to be in the world. And I'm not saying that it's false. But there are times that I'm like, and as I get older, learning to be with people. No, I'm not feeling great today. And I'm not going to do it with everybody, but no, my body hurts. No, I don't feel good because I was so conditioned, right? And, it's like that model minority, or, I'm sure, Kiva, you've had experiences, how I have to not be that. I don't want to be that threatening present, be non-threatening.
Yeah. I just had an experience. What's today? This was yesterday, by the way, and with regards to that. And so, I hear you talk. You talk a lot about the physical trauma of and I'm using your word, being disabled. And there's a psychological component to that too. There could be a psychological component. You know, I know as a man of color, as an African American male, I'm able-bodied, but I still get some psychological trauma every time I turn a corner and, you know, I pass a police car and he comes right behind me. There's something psychologically that happens internally that I can't describe. It's this tenseness. You know, I can't describe it. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like
psychological? Yeah.
Has there been a time where you experienced that as a result of, and, you know, and I want to talk a little bit too about the word disability.
Yeah.
But, you know,
I mean, certainly physical trauma, years of being in and out of hospitals. You know, I always say that often the sense of isolation, which we've all kind of experienced with COVID, but anyone with an illness, a chronic illness, the psychological sense of isolation can be much worse than the physical pain, much worse. And so, you know, I've had to work through a lot of that. And again, I feel like my parents supported me so well in that. I mean, from an early age, like, you know, working through that psychological and realizing that was legitimate, like my psychological pain, not just the physical pain. And we're not just going to help you with your body, but we're going to help you emotionally and psychologically. And, but yes, I mean, it is hard.
Yeah. So there are burdens.
Yes.
That people who are different in various ways have to bear. Now, what impressed me, and I'd like you to, if you feel comfortable talking about this, you seem to have a way to put people at ease with your disability. And could you talk about how you do that and how you came to do that? And, you know, is that a burden? You know, I don't have to do that.
Right. Sure. It is a person with a physical disability. It is always on us to make other people feel comfortable with us and our different bodies. And for some of us, our different, how our minds work, you know, intellectual disabilities. And so at times it can be a burden. I've also seen, though, because because of all the work I've done on myself, I'm pretty comfortable in my body. And I would rather I am at ease with myself. And so that helps me be at ease with other people. But I'd rather have a conversation with people so that they can become at ease, because I do feel like I get tired of this, but part of what I'm supposed to do is educate and help so that the next generation of kids growing up with disabilities, maybe people will think twice. I mean, I love kids. I adore kids because they are so real and so honest. I just recently was at a pool. It's summertime. And I'm in my wheelchair, and this little kid, he's 8 years old. First of all, he fixates on my feet. Like, I'm in the wheelchair. You would think he would say, "You're in a chair." No, my feet. Your feet are weird. And I'm like, yeah, they kind of are. And so we just start talking, and his mother comes up to me, and I learn his name, and he learns, and then I'm a person. Then I'm a human being. And then I'm like, you know, and then his mom, and she was great. She didn't shy away from it. And she's like, "He's really chatty." I'm like, "It's great. He can ask me anything," because guess what? This 8-year-old is going to think the next person isn't weird or strange, just different. I'm like, "I'm just different. How are you different than other, you know?" So, and then
you need physical help from other people.
I do
to navigate. I mean,
I do.
And so you have said, I heard you say, or someone repeated what you said, is People have been touching me all my life. I'm okay with it.
Right.
Don't
Yes.
worry about helping me.
Right. And, and
Take
if
my
you
arms,
do,
help me stand up, whatever. Yeah.
Right. And if you do, just be honest and say, and I will say if that's okay or not okay, because I've been in this body 50 years. I, know how to navigate. And I also know that most people don't know how to. And so, so just ask those, but adults, we're just too darn polite. Instead, like you said, Kiva, it's microaggressions. Instead of just saying, well, I'm kind of uncomfortable with you. I mean, and I know we can't do that with everybody, but that's why I love kids. They're just so refreshing because they're just so real. And I'm like, adults I wonder the same things.
Yeah. But I think part of it is the piece you talk about, Emily, is it's got to be a reflection and self-analysis before you could say first to that person that I'm uncomfortable with you, to them, you got to say it to yourself.
Well, that's true.
I think that's very important. I wanted to talk about the word disability for a second because I can recall about a year or so ago, I was doing a training. Well, this is actually more than a year. It was before COVID-19. I was doing an in-person training, and I was talking a little bit about diversity. The different social identities that we come with in society. And I used the word. I said I like using the word physically impaired. I really don't like using the word disability because the word the dis is particularly in my. So I grew up in New York City, and the dis, when you diss somebody, you disrespecting that person. The dis is kind of like a negative connotating word. So you have disqualified, you have disadvantaged, you have disengaged, and so I try to use the word impairment, and I thought that was a more culturally sensitive word.
Yeah,
I know back in the 80s and 90s, the word handicap was transitioned from we don't hear handicap anymore. We use this whole language transition, right? So what's the correct word? Like, as I said impairment, I said somebody was physically impaired. A lady came up to me and said, "Oh, well, my son is developmentally." I use developmentally disabled too. She said, no, we try to say that he's developmentally different.
Right.
He has different abilities. So what's the positive reframe or the strength base? What would you say?
Well, yes, I've been called it all. I mean, I grew up with being called handicapped. I think that was, but I've even been called crippled, which that I cringe at.
Deaf, mute, lame, all those words have been moved out of our vocabulary as society transitions. Yes. But there's still some words that are negatively connotated.
Yes. The new word that I love that doesn't apply to me, but I love the word neurodiverse.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I don't know if you've heard that, but people with intellectual, because it's such a range. I mean, that's the thing. There is in the disability community or whatever, there's just such a range of differences. And I love that. I wish I could come up with something physically diverse, but neurodiverse. Differently abled.
Differently abled.
I think for me, the biggest thing is, and this is in recent years too, but it's instead of saying the disabled person, the blind person as an identifier, as the first identifier, it's a person with. So it's a person. You're a person. You're a human being.
In social work, we call that the person-centered or person-first perspective. Yes. Like, instead of calling somebody a drug addict, he has an addiction issue, or Miss Johnson is afflicted by drug addiction. But the person first perspective.
That I think is a change that I want to see. And I even don't do it for myself all the time because I'm conditioned by the world that I live in. But for me, that is really, and from my religious background, and the parts of my faith that I struggle with in the Bible, of all the healings, it's always the blind, the lame,
the leper.
Like that's the only thing they're known for. And so changing that, reframing it
Yeah.
is to be like, yes, the person who is
Right.
or who has.
Right.
And so I try really hard. I'm a person with a physical disability, but yeah, I like physical
Diverse. I like physically
or
diverse.
physical
That's
impairment,
new.
but yes, but I tried to do differently abled, but I don't know, I don't know. It's
It
just
sounds so cliche. To me, it sounds so clichéic. It's like it's a
right.
cliche. Like I want to be authentic when I meet people, so I try to.
Right.
And it's just like it's
right.
one of those things you have to be culturally sensitive to.
Yeah, you do. I'll tell you a funny thing my husband says, and this is just a joke. He calls me handy capable.
Oh,
I was actually thinking about.
You're handy capable.
I was thinking about, as you were talking, physically enabled.
Right.
She's a physically enabled person.
Right.
So you touched on, and we've gone now all these minutes and haven't really talked about religion.
I know.
But you are a priest,
right?
So I'm really curious how you find what is the theology behind anti-racism and discrimination. Where do you find that inspiration?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, it is in the message of Jesus, even though there are problematic things for me as a person with a disability with some of the stories of the Bible. But I always say we're the ones that always focus on the cure. Jesus does always focus on the person. It's always it is always about meeting the person where they are, seeing them, acknowledging their pain, their suffering, and freeing them from that. Whether it's an illness or whether it's an outcast person or whether it's, a sinner or tax collector or whatever. But for me, Jesus' message is the message of love. And Jesus's message is about we're called to be people of love God and love one another, period. And that's actually from, the Jewish heritage, love God, it's from the commandments. But so for me, it's trying to follow in his way of love. And so when whatever it is in another person, if we are intentionally or unintentionally holding up those systems of oppression, because that's the other thing, we look at the example of Jesus, and what he was saying is the oppressive empire of, and the oppressive systems that were keeping people poor and hungry and suffering. And it wasn't just the empire, but it was also the religious systems that were oppressing people. He came, he was a political figure. When people say, keep politics out of the church, Jesus was as political as anyone. And he came to destroy those oppressive powers, to say there is another way. And how we treat one another and how we care for one another and how we have compassion for one another. I experienced it growing up in the church. A person with a disability living in an able-bodied world felt like an outcast a lot of times. But the church, I didn't. The church, I found a home, a place where I belonged, a place where I was loved. Not only that, but really empowered to figure out who I was and my gifts and to do things I never thought I could do, like be a priest of the church. And so, and that comes out of the witness of Jesus. And so for me, following him, and I, do it, I make mistakes all the time, but really realizing that in my own small way, I am called to help, release the captives, give freedom to the captives, release them from bondage, and whatever. And what I mean by that is that can mean a whole lot of different things. But really help people find healing, wholeness, and freedom in the name of Jesus.
Wow.
And it wasn't just your parents, it was the community that they put you in, a church that rallied around you and
It was.
made you feel welcome and engaged you in the mainstream of
gave
what
me
was
a
going.
place to be, and not just be the little girl in the wheelchair in the pews that we all feel sorry for, but the young woman preaching from the pulpit, when there weren't women preachers in my church, and certainly not one that looked like me, and really helped me claim my voice and claim my story and let that have meaning in other people's lives.
We have a member of our family who was profoundly disabled from birth, and his mom and dad, it's a niece and son, and they would take him to church, and the people asked them to not bring him to church.
Oh,
and that's the reverse of what you experienced.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, when I hear you talk about this, I'm not physically disabled. I have experience as an African American man, social disability, and in terms of where I can go and where I cannot go, and how all of those things. And so I
how
think
you're treated.
Yeah. So when Dr. Kathleen Crenshaw talks about this concept, she frames this concept of intersectionality. And I know I just want to share this real quick. So she said, our social identities, depending on our social identity makeup, age, race, gender, sexual orientation, when those things cross, it will be what we call the difference maker, and whether or not we have lived experiences of privilege or lived experiences of oppression. And that the race identifier is the difference maker, the first difference maker. And then the gender identity is kind of like the second one. So what I mean by that is, let's say we have two individuals that are quote unquote disabled, right? And one is an Emily Richards and the other one is a Shaquan Jackson.
Yeah.
Right. And they're into the same thing, but the one difference maker of race will make a clear difference about that person's lived experience. And so I wanted to say to you, ask you, what do you think would be different in the life of a person of color who may be in a similar situation as you?
What would I say to a person, or again, I think that this ties into my calling, my vocation in the church, but I do feel like how can we as a society help the person of color who is disabled have the same rights and privilege and opportunities and healthcare. Essential rights, healthcare, education. And I think that what I would hope and pray for someone in a similar situation to mine, but color of skin being different, is that they find those advocates and allies to help them, claim what they need and share their voice and be heard. And when they feel discouraged and no one cares and no one listens, that they have, whatever community is or whatever individual, or I guess that's my hope and prayer, because that's what got me through, and that's what continues to get me through, and it's why I'm in the church, a very flawed institution, by the way, with a, but I've seen it at its best.
Yeah.
And I do know that the African American the church has been a place where they've been able to pray for that freedom, for that release from oppression, and to believe that Jesus is their savior. Maybe not here right now, but hold on to that and have that hope, cling to that hope. But I mean, that's what I would want for anyone in a similar situation to mine, so that they will be heard and honored and not ignored. Their cries not go unheard.
Yeah. John, you used the word burden a couple of times throughout our conversation today. There's a book out by Kimmel and Ferber called Privilege, and I use it in the course I teach at Rutgers. And they use this concept and equating to a person who is African American, and let's say they had a disability, or a person who is African American and they may have a different gender identity than the societal norm. They said that person would experience what they call a double burden in society, in comparison to a white counterpart who has the same identity makeup, They could be disabled, they could be have a gender, but the same thing across the board. But that one difference makeup, race, would create a double burden for that person of color in society.
Right.
Now, speaking of people of color, you have a person of color, a woman of color in your family.
Yeah. So
could you talk about that?
I am a parent through the gift of adoption, and I have an almost 16-year-old, and she is an Asian American. She was born in China. We went over there and became parents and brought her home. And she is my greatest gift ever is to be a parent, to be her mother. And in recent years, in COVID time, I mean, I always knew, I always wanted her to be proud of who she, again, just like my parents, how they instilled in me that sense of self-worth and dignity. Always wanted. And so, very proud of her heritage. Took her back to China when she was 10 and went to the orphanage and had these experiences and met the man who found her, and, just really pride in that part of her story, which could create shame for her. And so really wanted to instill that in her. And so been open all along with her, and want her to be proud of Asian American and grapple with what that means, that identity. But I will say, in COVID, I mean, I just never, I got a glimpse, just a tiny glimpse. And I mean, a tiny glimpse of what it must be like for a mother of a Black child, and the fear, just a little bit, because of the way she was all of a sudden perceived as, discriminated against and prejudiced, and, the Chinese go back, and the China, illness, or the, what China flu, and just how, and she was even a little fearful, because she had heard stories of her friends who are, Chinese born and have been yelled at on the streets and, treated differently. And of course, Asian Americans are the model minority, and learn that. They learn that it's deep within their DNA on how to be that smart, good American. And the fearfulness that all of a sudden I had for my precious child, who is just the most wonderful, beautiful, amazing creature ever. And people to look at her because of this one thing about her, and because of her skin and the way her face is and the shape of her face and her features. And it just hit me, and it really took me aback. And I actually preached. I preached on this after George Floyd's murder, saying that what I cried about was his mother, seeing this happen to him, thinking about his family, and just weeping for them, and just like, how do we live in a world where this can happen? And so just that, and I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it's like to be a parent of a Black child and worried about your sons going off and not coming back because of, they're killed in the safe streets of their cities, supposedly. But just it was like, I felt like overnight, all of a sudden, this fearfulness.
You had a what we call a racially traumatized experience, and what that emotion that you're talking about. Mothers go through that all the time.
I know.
And mothers of African American children, particularly boys,
right?
Particularly males. Yes. And so me and John, I think we talked about this, John, in our back and forth interviews, our initial interviews in the launch of the podcast series, was having to have the talk with your kids, particularly African American boys, because it could be traumatically induced from a racial standpoint as a mother of an African American child. Let's say, for example, sending him away to a school in Mississippi or in
Kentucky.
Or in the South. It can be, it's a great thing that he's able to go to college, but in the back of her mind, she's constantly worrying about the what ifs. And so it sounds like you had a similar experience.
I had a moment of, and I'm just like, oh my God, this is what, how do they live? And how do they still live with hope and joy? And, why aren't they even, I just had this just deep sadness and anger, and, because of just my limited, and, she goes to a racially diverse school and is totally respected and safe, and she goes to a church that respects her, and she's growing up in a family and all of that, and yet, like, you send them out, and so it opened my mind and heart, and it gave me a new level of just empathy, but also I don't know what the word is, but in awe. I mean, I use the word awe. In awe of mothers of children of color who have to go through this on a daily basis. And so, and I mean, and I do worry about my daughter because of the United States-China relationship, and I want her to be proud of, and just saying, no matter what the US government says or thinks about China, this is not about the people of China. It's one government and another government. But the anger, I think also that I've worked so hard to instill in her, that pride of who she is, and self-worth and love, and how society can take that away from you. And and keep realizing I just got to keep working at that with her, because she's been in these safe communities in her own bubble, very different bubble than I grew up in. And and I'm glad she needs a different kind of bubble, but she's not always going to be in these communities that value. And she's an ally. She's a huge, I love it. She's a almost 16-year-old and I love that she has so many friends who are diverse, color and ethnicity and religion and gender diversity. And she is like all in about being an ally. I mean, and I love that. I had to learn that really as an adult, and she's getting it as a kid.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we
awesome.
are near the end of our time.
Yeah, this was great.
And one of the questions we'd like to ask is, who's your role model in the area of social racial justice? But I think maybe you already mentioned.
So I will tell you, the Right Reverend Duncan Gray.
Okay.
Who is now in the nearer presence of God. But look him up. Okay. He is one of those unsung heroes of the civil rights movement in the thick of it in Mississippi.
Wow.
And boy, did he help transform the white church. And I will say, I am so proud to be an Episcopalian because of stories like his, because the white privileged Episcopal Church in Mississippi was one of the only churches that was there in the civil rights movement with Black sisters and brothers fighting the fight. Mm-hmm. And really, I'm very proud of that part of our history.
It's a good heritage we have.
It's a good heritage.
And just to conclude, a couple of weeks ago, we did a really wonderful, I thought it was terrific podcast with a fellow by the name of David Marinus, who wrote about the first Black basketball player in the SEC, Perry Wallace. And I'm going to make sure that if you listen to any of our podcasts, I
really want to listen to the first,
because it talks a lot about Kentucky.
Well, and process. I will say that is a shameful part of our. Yeah, it is, and it's a reckoning I've had to. Because I love basketball, but yeah. So, but yes, I will definitely watch that or listen and watch.
Cool.
Well, great.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. Kiva, do you have any final questions?
No, I just want to thank you for your transparency and just, educating us on your lived experiences and giving words of encouragement for those folks who may be physically different in our society, and how to, make everybody feel welcome in this diverse world. And so I really appreciate you coming on the show and joining us. And so thank you all again. Thank you all for listening and watching. Please subscribe and join us again for another courageous conversation on our Race to Social Justice. Continue the journey, everybody.
The Race to Social Justice podcast is produced, edited, and mixed at The Dream in Austin, Texas. Visit thedreamrecordingstudio.com for more info.